Andrei Novak, financial and economic expert, is joining us now. Hello, Andrei.
Greetings. Yes, hello.
Andrei, I'd like to start with this dual position, which is more prevalent here, politics or in fact money, the interest in money, yes, financial interests. So the US allowed a Russian oil tanker to reach Cuba. US ships did not intercept the Russian vessel carrying 730,000 barrels of oil to Cuba. Donald Trump stated, and I quote, that he does not see a problem with such deliveries, despite the blockade of the island he previously announced, as well as the sanctions against against the shadow fleet of the Russian Federation. Yes, of course, we remember that. As far as I recall, partial sanctions were lifted until April 19th. So how do you see this dual position where the European partners of the US are detaining Russian tankers and sticking to their stance while the US is doing the opposite? Do you see more political maneuvering here? And what impact does such a dual position have? Doesn't this reinforce Russia's confidence that it can do whatever it wants and continue trading oil regardless?
Well, I think that the dual position is actually only on the part of the United States because the European Union has a clear stance. On the one hand, to strengthen sanctions against Russia, and on the other hand, to increase support for Ukraine. But as for the US administration here, it's probably not just a dual position, it's triple, even quadruple, and it can change several times in a single day. This position can shift multiple times. So it's difficult to predict how the US administration will act in the morning. And it's just as hard to predict how they'll act in the evening of the same day. But if we're talking about this particular story that the United States let a Russian oil tanker through to Cuba, well, the argument here is probably humanitarian, to ensure that the Cuban people, the Cubans, don't continue to suffer from the lack of electricity, which they've already been without or have had problems with for several weeks now. Well, I suppose this is a kind of humanitarian mission by the United States, so that it's not the Cuban people who suffer, but rather the United States probably wants to deal with the still communist Cuban government, but so that ordinary Cubans don't suffer. That's probably it, because I can't explain this action any other way for now. But on the other hand, if we talk about EU sanctions against Russia, right now there is discussion about strengthening these sanctions, specifically targeted at the shadow fleet. Based on reports from insider sources, there is a serious discussion about banning the servicing of Russian vessels by European ports. There are three main options being considered. First, targeting only Russian tankers flying the Russian flag. Second, including those tankers plus any others transporting Russian oil under any flag. Finally, the third option, in addition to these, is a complete ban on the servicing of all Russian cargo. Not just oil, but absolutely anything. Since by now, well, the deeply concerning information that Russia regularly sells stolen Ukrainian grain, which is grown and essentially stolen from the temporarily occupied parts of Ukraine, has become very well known. This systematic looting of agricultural resources from sovereign Ukrainian lands has been documented extensively by international observers and is now widely understood by the global community. So there are three options here. Of course, the third option would suit us best. A complete ban on any Russian cargo under any flag from any country, not just Russia itself. But what decision the EU will ultimately make, well, we'll probably have to wait a few more days to find out. But in any case, if the EU has already made a political decision, specifically a political decision to strengthen sanctions targeted directly at the Russian shadow fleet, this already shows that the overall policy of pressure on the aggressor country, on Russia, is not only not decreasing, not only is it not, as the Kremlin would like, that everyone is tired of Ukraine or has grown weary of Ukraine and Russia's war against Ukraine. On the contrary, we see that at the very least the EU is unequivocal, absolutely clear in this position, and is working solely on methods and tools for further strengthening the sanctions pressure on Russia. We are already seeing various manifestations of this increased pressure, and this means the blocking of Russian ships, and not only those under the Russian flag, but under any flag, if it is determined that they are carrying Russian cargo or Russian oil or oil products. This situation clearly demonstrates that yet another so-called red line, the firm agreement not to interfere with anything Russian, was actually crossed several weeks ago, marking a significant shift in the ongoing conflict. And this has already been done by the American military, as well as the French and the Finnish. By the way, it was the Finns who started it. I want to remind you, it was the Finns who were the first to detain a vessel carrying Russian cargo. So this is a general policy of tightening sanctions, at least on the part of the EU, and it's already systematic. You could say it's become systematic. This, of course, gives hope that Russia's economic capabilities will decrease and are already decreasing, in fact, practically every day. Every day, Russia suffers direct economic losses, both in terms of exports, its main export commodity, oil and petroleum products, and in terms of its ability to produce these petroleum products. But here, the main credit, without a doubt, goes to the armed forces of Ukraine, who are striking very effectively at, in fact, the entire oil production chain. So far, the only thing Ukrainian forces haven't targeted yet are the oil wells. But I think that's not really necessary at all. If major oil refineries and critical transshipment ports are effectively put out of commission and rendered completely inoperable, then that would be more than enough of a blow to very significantly reduce, or in some specific cases, even completely halt, the ongoing production and the subsequent supply of various Russian oil products to the global market. And this is Russia's main source of revenue, and this in turn already significantly reduces Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine with the same intensity as before. And this is exactly what Ukrainian military personnel are now noticing and recording: the number of so-called attacks and assaults, the quality of these attacks, the presence of equipment in these attacks, and what kind of equipment is being used. All of this indicates that the Russian army is indeed being drained, not only in terms of direct losses of manpower and equipment, but also financially and economically. In other words, the Russian army is no longer being supplied materially and technically at the same level as last year, or especially as in 2022 or 2023. This means, firstly, that international sanctions, although slow, are indeed working systematically and effectively. In the second place, and once again, I really like the word systematic, the systematic and persistent attacks by the armed forces of Ukraine on Russia's primary and most vital economic resources and infrastructure are also having a significantly positive and measurable impact. Here, one could even argue about which sanctions are more effective: these international legal financial sanctions or our Ukrainian military sanctions. Here one could even start some kind of table, start keeping a table comparing the effectiveness of these gentle international sanctions, so to speak, and the direct Ukrainian strike sanctions. And here I think gradually the advantage is shifting in favor of the armed forces of Ukraine. But for us, the main thing is that what is happening is precisely the financial and economic bleeding of Russia, because this impact will last for a long time. And perhaps most significantly of all, Russia has absolutely no viable means of making up for these massive losses that it is now suffering throughout its entire oil and gas sector. There is quite literally nothing available at this time to compensate for such a decline, because Russia does not produce or export anything of interest to the world except oil and petroleum products. Everything else, Russia simply doesn't know how to produce, even for its own domestic market, let alone for the rest of the world. Therefore, as we can see, even Napoleon used to say, what is war? War is three things: money, money, and money. And that was back when war was not as technological as it is now. Now, modern technological, or I would even say high-tech, warfare depends entirely on the economic capacity to wage that war. And here, once again, the balance is gradually shifting in favor of
Ukraine. Andrei, I actually wanted to discuss this very topic with you. You already mentioned these strikes, and let us also recall that on the night of March 29th, long-range drones from Ukraine's defense forces hit the Ust-Luga oil terminal in Russia's Leningrad region for the second time in a week. As a result of the new attack, serious consequences have been recorded. A new fire broke out. Let us recall that in recent weeks, Ukrainian forces have successfully struck Russian oil infrastructure in the Baltic Sea several times. As emphasized by Andriy Kovalenko, head of the Center for Countering Disinformation at Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, the port of Ust-Luga is gradually ceasing to exist.